Colorado Territory. May 1880. The wind was sharp and dry as it swept across the foothills outside of Pueblo, carrying the scent of dust and lilac. Kallie Carrigan didn't stop running until her satin shoes tore at the toes and her lungs burned like fire. She didn't look back, couldn't. There was nothing behind her but a chapel full of strangers, a man she didn't love waiting at the altar, and a father who had bartered her future like it was a bushel of wheat. She stumbled down a slope and into tall grass, the full skirts of her wedding dress snagging in the brush. She yanked herself free and pressed forward, heart thudding in her chest. Somewhere out here, away from lace and lies, was the freedom she was ready to fight for. The storm rolled in fast. Lightning cracked over the ridgeline, and thunder bellowed straight through her bones. Rain came next, cold, heavy, and unrelenting. Her thin sleeves soaked through in seconds, and still she kept going. She spotted the barn just before dusk fell. Nestled along a narrow creek bed, half hid beneath a stand of cottonwoods, it looked weathered but solid. Smoke curled from a chimney atop the small cabin beside it, but the barn was closer. She pushed the heavy door open and stepped into the dim quiet, breath catching on the scent of hay and horses. A soft nicker sounded from the far stall. A lantern hung near the entrance, casting a low glow over saddles, tools, and a rough wooden workbench. She edged inside, dragging the muddy hem of her dress behind her. She didn't see him at first. "You lost." The voice came from the shadows, deep, low, and edged with suspicion. Kallie flinched, turning. A man stepped into the lantern light, wiping his hands on a cloth. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with sandy brown hair and a week's worth of stubble across his jaw. His eyes were steady and cautious, the color of riverstone. She held her chin high. "No," his gaze dropped to her ruined dress, then back up. "Sure looks like it. I need a place to stay. Just for tonight." He studied her for a moment, long enough that she felt the weight of it. Then he nodded once, slow and deliberate. "Name's Rylan Cole," he said, setting the cloth aside. "You can sleep up in the loft. There's blankets. You hungry?" She nodded stiffly, her pride cracking at the edges. "I'll bring you something." He left without asking names or questions, and she sank to the straw-covered floor, the heat of tears pressing behind her eyes. By the time he returned, she had peeled off the lace gloves and loosened the corset so she could breathe. He handed her a plate of cornbread and beans, still warm from the fire, and didn't comment on the way her hands trembled. "I'm Kallie," she said at last, voice soft. "Kallie Carrigan." Rylan gave a slow nod, his expression unreadable. "You from town?" "No," she said. "Not anymore." He didn't push further. Lightning flashed again beyond the barn walls, but inside it was calm quiet in a way that made her chest ache. She ate in silence while he fed the horses. When she finished, she climbed the ladder to the loft, curled into the blankets, and listened to the storm ease into a steady patter against the roof. She fell asleep to the sound of his boots on the barn floor. Morning came gold and clear. Sunlight poured through the slats in the wood, and Kallie blinked awake to the smell of coffee and the warmth of hay beneath her. Rylan was already working when she made her way down, sleeves rolled, shirt damp with sweat. He glanced over once, then went back to hauling feed to the horses. "I'll be gone by noon," she said, brushing at her wrinkled dress. He didn't look up. "You got somewhere to go?" Kallie hesitated. "No, then stay." She stared at him, brows lifting. "I can use the help," he added, nodding toward the tack wall. "You look like you can hold a brush." She frowned. "You just going to let a stranger stay here? You ran in during a storm in a wedding dress. I figure something bad chased you. Whatever it was, it ain't here." That was the first moment she started to breathe again. She stayed. By the third day, she had washed her dress and hung it in the barn rafters like a ghost from another life. Rylan gave her simple tasks: feeding chickens, brushing down the horses, hauling water. He spoke little, but his eyes always softened when they met hers. Noticed the calluses forming on her palms. Noticed how she smiled more now than she did that first stormy night. One afternoon, she watched him from the porch while he split wood. His shirt clung to his back and the muscles in his arms moved like clean water. When he noticed her, he paused, rested the axe against the stump, and walked over. "You staring at me for a reason?" he asked, voice low. She didn't look away. "Maybe." He stood there, not touching her, not moving. "Just waiting. I was supposed to marry a man named Everett," she said. "He was twice my age. My father owed him money." Rylan's jaw tightened. "I ran. I didn't know where I was going. Just away." "You did right," he said, and his voice was like gravel and honey. That evening, he brought her into the cabin for supper. The kitchen was small but neat, and the fire was warm. She helped him cook. He did not mention the way her hand brushed his. She did not mention the spark it sent up her arm. Afterward, they sat on the porch and watched the sun dip low behind the hills. The silence between them had softened like cloth worn smooth over time. "I never wanted to marry Everett," she said. "I figured. But I think I want to stay here." Rylan looked at her then. Really looked. "Then stay." She smiled. "I want to earn it." "You already are." She stood, dusting off her skirt, and moved to step inside. But his hand caught hers just for a second. "Kallie." She turned. "You are safe here." Her throat caught. She nodded and stepped inside. And for the first time in her life, she felt like she had walked into a place that could be hers. Kallie stood barefoot in the creek behind the cabin, hem of her borrowed skirt tucked into her knees, the cold water threading between her toes. The sun was higher now, warm against her shoulders, and the trees overhead whispered softly. Around her, the hush of the land settled into her bones, honest, unhurried, and nothing like the parlors and perfumed lies she'd grown up around. She hadn't worn shoes since that morning 3 days past, when she'd found her way to the cabin's wash basin and scrubbed off the last of the rouge her stepmother insisted she wear. The corset hung behind the barn now, stiff and forgotten. Rylan hadn't commented on the change, but she noticed the way his eyes lingered longer when she passed him carrying water or feeding the hens. She bent to rinse a pan in the current, brushing away the last flecks of dried dough. Behind her, boots crunched on gravel. "You're gonna catch cold if you stand in there too long," Rylan said, stepping out from the trees with an armful of fence posts balanced across his shoulder. She didn't turn right away. "I'd rather feel cold water than hot lies." He dropped the posts beside the trail and leaned against a birch, thumbs hooked into his belt. "You ever worked a branding?" She shook her head. "Tomorrow we got calves to mark. You'll want gloves. And boots." "I don't have boots." He pushed off the tree. "I'll find you a pair." They walked back toward the cabin side by side, the space between them easy now, like something familiar instead of forbidden. Inside, she swept the hearth while he cleaned his rifle. The silence between them carried weight, but not discomfort. She found herself watching the way he oiled each hinge, careful and precise, like a man used to getting things right the first time. "You lived here long?" she asked, not looking up. 6 years. "Alone?" He nodded once. "You were married?" "No," she set the broom aside. "What brought you here?" He rested the rifle on the table and met her eyes. Didn't care for the way men talked back east. Too many words, not enough truth. She understood that. More than she could say. Later, they ate by lamplight salt pork, boiled potatoes, and a mess of wild greens she'd gathered from the slope near the barn. Afterward, he offered her a book from the shelf beside the hearth. She traced the cracked spine of it, surprised. "You read much?" she asked. "When there's time." She flipped the cover open. "I never had much chance. My father said it wasn't necessary for a girl to read more than a Bible verse." "That's foolish." She looked up, startled by the sharpness in his voice. He didn't soften it. "A sharp mind's worth more than a full dowry." She closed the book gently. "You always say what you think?" He leaned back in his chair. "Only when it matters." That night, she sat on the porch after the lamp was out, fingers curled around a cup of tea, watching the stars blink to life over the hills. Rylan came out only once to check the latch on the barn door. He paused beside her a moment. "You could have a life here, if you wanted one." She didn't answer right away. "I don't know what I want yet." she said finally. He nodded and stepped down into the dark, leaving her with the crickets and the hush of wind through cottonwood leaves. In the morning, the branding began before sunrise. Smoke coiled into the sky and the scent of singed hair clung to everything. Kallie wore a pair of worn boots and gloves too big for her hands, but she kept pace, holding calves steady while Rylan marked them with a practiced hand. Her muscles ached by midday and her throat burned from the dust, but she didn't stop. When it was done, they sat in the shade of the lean-to, drinking water from a tin pail. Rylan leaned his elbows on his knees, sweat streaking the dirt on his jaw. "You didn't quit," he said. "I'm not built for quitting." He studied her, something unreadable in his gaze. "You're not what I expected." She tipped the pail back for another drink. "Neither are you." He reached out then, slow and certain, and brushed a smear of ash from her cheek. His fingers were warm, rough, and lingered a second longer than they needed to. She didn't pull away. The silence held between them, full of something that hadn't been there a week ago. Something steadier than fear. Something waiting to be named. By late May, the cottonwoods had leafed out full, and the air carried more warmth than wind. Kallie woke earlier now, before the rooster, and moved through her chores without needing to ask what came next. She'd stitched a new hem into one of Rylan's shirts, and wore it belted over a skirt she'd taken in with borrowed thread. Her hands were stronger than they'd ever been, and her thoughts quieter. That morning, she was down by the root cellar stacking kindling when Rylan came from the woods with a hair slung over his shoulder. His boots were damp with creek mud, and his sleeves rolled past the elbow. She straightened as he approached. "You hunt every morning?" she asked. "No. Just when the pantry's low. You could have sent me. You weren't raised to track in silence." She didn't bristle. "You could teach me." He looked at her for a beat, then nodded once. "Tomorrow," he said. "We'll go before sunrise." He skinned the rabbit on a flat stone behind the barn, and she watched from a few paces off, not squeamish, only curious. He worked with precision, his blade moving clean through the sinew. She crouched nearby, tying kindling into bundles. "You ever think about leaving here?" she asked. His hands paused, then resumed. "Not in a long while." "Why?" He didn't answer at first, just set the blade aside and rinsed his hands in the basin. When he looked at her, his expression was unreadable. Some places make sense to a man. This one does. She didn't press him. That afternoon, while he mended a fence near the southern pasture, Kallie found an old short-handled hoe in the shed and cleared a patch of dirt beside the cabin door. The ground was dry, but she worked slow, breaking it up with rhythm and care, stopping only once to shade her face from the sun. By the time Rylan returned, her arms were streaked with dust and her braid hung loose over one shoulder. "You planning to work that piece of ground?" he asked, wiping sweat from his brow. "I thought I might try planting something." He glanced at the soil, then back at her. "We've got seed potatoes stored, and a little corn if the birds don't take it. I'd like that." He leaned against the porch post, watching her a moment longer. "You ever planted before?" "No, but I watched the field hands when I was a child. That's a start." She wiped her palms on her skirt. "What about you? What did you grow up knowing?" He tilted his head slightly. "That working with your hands teaches you more than being talked at ever does." She smiled, not because it was funny, but because it was true. That night, a coyote called from the ridge beyond the creek, long and low. Kallie stood on the porch, arms crossed, listening. Rylan joined her without a word, his presence quiet beside her. "Do you miss anyone?" she asked, her voice barely above the hush of evening. He didn't look at her. "I had a brother once. Died in Kansas during the war." She nodded slowly, not prying, not offering useless sympathies. He turned his head. "What about you?" "I had a mother who taught me to braid a ribbon into my hair. She died when I was 11. After that, everything changed." He said nothing, just reached over and took the mug from her hands, his fingers brushing hers, then set it on the railing. He didn't move away. The dusk folded around them like a blanket, and the silence wasn't hollow. It held the shape of something steady growing between them. When she finally turned in, her steps were slower, like something in her had shifted without needing to name it. The sun hadn't cleared the eastern ridge when Kallie followed Rylan up through the pines, her breath visible in the chill that still clung to the earth. Pine needles softened their steps and birds stirred overhead, quiet and curious. He carried a rifle across his back, and she held the coil of rope he'd set in her hands before they left the cabin. "Why the rope?" she asked, stepping over a fallen log. "In case we find something worth bringing back whole," he said. Snares quieter than a shot. They moved uphill, the light shifting from gray to amber as it filtered through the branches. Rylan paused near a bend in the trail and knelt to study the ground. Kallie crouched beside him, watching as he brushed aside a patch of needles to reveal a faint print. "Doe," he murmured. She moved through at first light. "How do you know it's a doe?" "Lighter step. Buck break more ground." She leaned closer, taking in the detail. "You always notice things like that?" He straightened. "You have to. The land doesn't speak loud." They didn't catch anything that morning, but when they circled back toward the cabin, Callie's shoulders carried less tension. Her feet ached, but it was the kind of ache that came from effort, not fear. At the edge of the trees, Rylan slowed. "If you're going to stay through summer, we'll need to build a second shed," he said. "Weather turns quick come September." She glanced at him, surprised. "You're already thinking that far ahead?" He didn't look at her when he answered. "I don't take temporary things into account." She let the words settle before she spoke again. "I'd help build it. I know you would." They reached the cabin just as the heat began to rise off the earth. Rylan brought out a cracked ledger from inside and spread it across the table on the porch. He turned it toward her. "These are the summer plans. Where we'll rotate the cattle. Where we'll try planting oats." Kallie traced the penciled lines with her fingertip. "You keep track of everything?" "My brother used to. I took it over after." She didn't ask anything more about the brother. She only nodded and read the markings carefully. "I could start writing things down too." "You'd want to." She met his gaze. "I'm learning more here than I ever did behind silk curtains." That evening, she took the shovel without being asked and began loosening the soil where she'd marked out her garden rows. Rylan set his tools down nearby and joined her. They worked in tandem, not speaking, not needing to. Dirt clung to her arms and his shirt stuck to his back, but when dusk came, there were 5 clean furrows and a quiet satisfaction between them. He leaned on the shovel and looked at her. "You ever think about what you'd do if you hadn't run?" "I try not to," she said. "But I would have had a house with rooms I couldn't leave and a husband who didn't care if I spoke. And now?" She looked at the garden rows, then at him. "Now I have air in my lungs and choices in my hands." He didn't smile, but something in his face softened. He reached for his canteen and passed it to her. She drank, then handed it back. "Tomorrow," he said, "we'll get the seed in. And I'll show you how to brace a post so the wind doesn't take it." She wiped her hands on her skirt. "I'd like that." They stood there as the sky turned from gold to slate, neither moving toward the cabin. He shifted his weight, then stepped closer. "I've been thinking," he said, voice low, "about what it means to keep something." She didn't speak. His hand brushed hers, just enough that she felt the roughness of his knuckles against her skin. "You're not here by accident, Kallie." She turned to him fully. "I don't feel like a mistake anymore." He leaned in, slow and sure, and kissed her once, steady and warm, like the land he'd built his life on. She didn't pull away. When they parted, she rested her forehead against his shoulder just for a breath. "Come fall," he said, "you'll have roots here if you want them." She looked up at him, the last of the daylight catching in her eyes. "I already do." The first corn seedlings pushed up through the soil in late June, pale and tentative. Kallie crouched beside them in the quiet morning light, brushing earth away from the tender leaves with careful fingers. The rows were uneven, but they were hers. Behind her, the door of the cabin creaked open. Rylan stepped out with a tin mug, his hair still damp from the basin. "They made it." "They did," she murmured. "Wasn't sure they would. They've got the same stubborn streak you do." She stood slowly, brushing dirt from her skirt. "I think I needed to see something grow. Something I put in the ground with my own hands." He passed her the mug. "It suits you." They shared the coffee on the porch, the silence between them full but unspoken. After a long moment, she said, "I'd like to write to my mother's sister in Missouri. Let her know I'm alive." He nodded. "You want me to ride with you into town?" "I'd rather you help me write it. I want the words to be right." He met her gaze. "Then we'll write it together." By midday, the heat pressed down like a hand and Rylan kept to the shade while repairing a wagon axle. Kallie brought him water, then lingered, watching as he tightened the bolts with slow, precise movements. "You ever think about making this a regular thing?" she asked. He didn't look up. "Wagon work?" "No. This." Her voice was quiet. "You and me. Not just sharing the work. Sharing the rest of it." He sat back on his heels and wiped his hands on a rag. "I've thought about it. And I've lived quiet a long time. Long enough I figured that was all there'd be. But I look at you, and I start thinking about winter woodpiles and morning coffee and someone beside me when the nights get long." She knelt beside him, her knees pressing into packed earth. "Then let's make it real." "You sure?" She reached for his hand. "I've never been more certain." He didn't kiss her right away. He just took her hand in both of his and held it there like something sacred. They married under the cottonwoods the following Sunday. No preacher, just the land and the creek and the warm silence between them. She wore a dress she'd sewn herself from calico traded for eggs, and he trimmed his beard and found a clean shirt. He offered no vows, only his presence, steady and rooted beside her. She offered no promises, only her hand, which he took without hesitation. That night, they sat on the porch with their shoulders touching and watched the sky turn violet. He reached for her, not in hunger, but in trust, and she leaned into it, her breath catching as he tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. "You made it through the storm," he said. "I did. And now I'm home." Years passed and the land carried their shape. The garden grew wider, the fences stronger. A cradle Rylan carved by hand sat beside the hearth by the winter after their second harvest. Their daughter, Clara, had Callie's eyes and Rylan's quiet steadiness. She learned to crawl under the same table where her mother had once traced penciled lines and asked about fence posts. Each season brought its own weight, but never the kind Kallie had known before. There were aches, yes, sore backs, low yields, a fever that passed through in the spring of '84, but none of it felt like breaking. It felt like building. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the ridge and the hens settled for the night, Kallie stepped out to find Rylan oiling the hinges on the barn door. "Clara's asleep," she said. "Figured she might be. She ran hard today. She wants a horse of her own." Rylan smiled faintly. "She's 5. She's your daughter." He set the oil can aside. "Then we better make space in the barn." She walked to him and leaned against his shoulder. "Did you ever think you'd have all this?" "I didn't let myself. And now?" He turned and kissed her temple. "Now I can't picture a day without it." The moon rose full behind the trees and the breeze carried the scent of sweetgrass. Inside, their child slept safe. Outside, the land held them both quiet, steady, and changed for the better. They stayed there, wrapped in the hush of evening, as the stars came out, one by one, and the cabin behind them glowed with the soft light of a fire they'd built together.